Do you ever wonder why the word visual is in the name of certain Microsoft products like Visual Basic or Visual Studio? The reason goes back to the early days of Visual Basic. One of its major innovations was the ability to use a visual designer to create the UI for the application. It was magical to be able to drag a control to a designer surface and have the tool generate the code. The excitement from that era seems so quaint nowadays. We live in an age where every tool is graphical. It's a given that our tools will leverage drag and drop designers. Visual Studio is full of these designers. Let's look at how they work. The designer component contains an area for working in a visual fashion with elements. The designer works in conjunction with other Visual Studio windows. In this image, we see two of these collaborators, the Toolbox and the code file. When you drag an item from the Toolbox to the designer creates an instance of the object and shows a graphical representation of the object on the designer's surface. At the same time, the designer generates some text and places it in the file. Usually this generated text is code, but sometimes it is XML or other text formats. When you modify the item in the designer, for example, moving the item to a new location, the designer modifies the code in the text file. There is another Visual Studio window that collaborates with the designer. That is called the property window. When you select an item in the designer, the property window displays the properties for that element. When you modify the values in the property window, the changes are sent back to the designer and it updates the UI and the code file accordingly. There are lots of designers in Visual Studio. Let's go look at a few. I'm inside Visual Studio. I've opened a solution called Designers and Toolbox, and I've included 3 separate projects: a web forms application, a Windows form application, and a WPF application. WPF stands for Windows Presentation Foundation. I picked these 3 project types because they all have visual designers. I also need to have the Toolbox open. If you do not see the Toolbox on your application, it's going to be over on the left side usually. If you do not see it, choose View, Toolbox. And if it still doesn't look like this, it might be pinned to the side by clicking Auto Hide. It might look like this on your computer. If it does, just click once on the Toolbox section and then click on Auto Hide. So now I'm ready. I'm going to open 4 files that have designers. I'm going to open my web forms app and open default.aspx. I'm going to open my Windows form app and open form1.vb, which is a Visual Basic file. I'm going to open up the WPF application and open up this class diagram.cd, and then I'm going to open this main window.xaml. All of these are examples of files that work with a designer. Let's start by looking at the class diagram. This represents one of the classes that I have inside my project. I'll talk more about this in a later movie. But this has a designer, and if I make changes to the designer, let's say add a method to this class, it will update my code file from this interface. It also has a toolbox over here, so I can click on this and choose a new class like that. That'll create a brand new file called author.cs. There it is. Close this window. Here's the default.aspx page. This is basically HTML. Now, if I click on this design section down here at the bottom, that opens up the designer, and now the toolbox knows that I'm working on an HTML or ASPX page and changes the number of items here to reflect the designer I have open. So this button is going to be an ASP.NET button. If I click on the split button, I can see both the HTML that was generated and the button that was created, a visual representation. If I drag the size of this button, it changes the text here in this text window. This also works for Windows Forms. Here's form1.vb. Same idea. Drag that button over here. Now, this doesn't have a split view because it's an older technology. Windows Forms has been around for 12 years, and it predates things like WPF and Silverlight. So let me show you the WPF application instead. We'll go over here to Main Window and open this up. The top half of the window represents the designer. The bottom half is my XML editor. And again, if I drag an item over from here, you'll see that it generates the control and outputs the correct button down here. Very nice, very handy. Resize the button, it does the right thing. Let me drag another button over here. Look at this. I get some lines that represent the alignment of these buttons. I'll talk more about this in the last chapter of this title. So I said I'd talk about the toolbox in this movie. I've showed you a little bit how the designers work, but let's concentrate on the toolbox. The toolbox is completely customizable. I can go over here to this section for common WPF controls, and I can right-click on it and choose to uncheck this list view. Do you see the difference? Now it just has this little icon here. It no longer has the text and the icon. The benefit of using this approach is I can see a lot more controls in my workspace. I can pick this text block and drag it over. It works just the same, but I have more working room in my toolbox. To switch it back, right-click and choose List View. You can add your own custom controls. If you have a third-party set of controls and you want to add them to the toolbox, you right-click and you choose Choose Items. Then in this dialog, you'll tell it where to look on your hard drive for the components you want. Since I'm in a WPF application, it's looking at my hard drive trying to find DLLs that contain WPF-specific controls. And it's found a number of them here. When I find one I like, I check it off and then click on OK, and that item will get added to my toolbox. And now I can drag that over to my designer surface and see if it'll generate the UI for that. Very nice. This also works with your own controls. I've created a control inside this WPF application called the tour bus control. This is what it looks like. Now I want to add this tour bus control to my main form. So what I do is I double-click on main window.xaml, and then Visual Studio is monitoring my projects and sees that I have a special kind of class in there called a user control class, and it updates my toolbox to reflect that. Here's my tour bus control. So without me having to do anything special, Visual Studio figured out I have this user control, added it to my toolbox, and now I can drag that over and drop it on my designer surface. Arrange it just like any other control, move it around, resize it, set properties in the property window, whatever. And you'll notice that down here it did the right thing and wrote the correct XML out for me. You can sort the items in this list, right-click and choose to sort them alphabetically. You can reset the toolbox if you ever make mistakes or delete controls accidentally. You want to send it back to the factory defaults. You can add your own tabs. So in that case, I created a tab and then I would name it here, Waltz tab. And then I can take my controls, like this bus control, and I could drag that down and put it on my tab. You can see I can drag these around and put them anywhere I want. Now there's a companion window that is often used when working with the toolbox and the designer. I'm talking about the properties window, which lives over here on the right. It's such an interesting tool that I made an entire movie about it, and it's the next one in this chapter.